Okay. Good evening, everybody. This is the July meeting of the Washington Township Historical Society, with people meeting in person at the Museum of Local History across from Maloney College. Welcome everybody here and on our Zoom presentation. And before I introduce our guest, why don't we just rise and salute the flag quickly, and then we will so after me. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, so we don't have anything on our business agenda for tonight. I'd like to introduce Rick Kelly, author of a recent book, his first one called Rancho to Ranch Homes, Mapping the Evolution of Castro Valley, California. And after I read this book, I thought to myself that there are a lot of similarities in terms of the development of the Eden Township, including Castro Valley, Washington Township area, and Murray Township, which is the Tri-Valley area. So we had 5 townships in Alameda County after the county was created. And this is an extremely thorough presentation. It will take about 90 minutes. We're going to take a break every 20 minutes for questions. And if you'd like to submit a question through the chat room or raise your hand, we'll note that and we'll bring your question forward. So in attendance tonight, beside our audience, we have President John Weed, myself as Vice President, and Tim Swenson, our Secretary, is taking care of all of our technical duties for tonight. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Rick and ask him to provide a short bio and then go into his presentation. Thank you, Rick, for joining us.
Thank you, Paul, for having me. I look forward to questions that come up from the audience, both here and at home on their computers. A little bit of background. I grew up in New Jersey and have been slowly working my way west since then. Went to school at the University of Pittsburgh and then grad school at the University of Cincinnati. And in 1983, I moved out to California to work at the Mare Island Naval Shipyard, where I worked in the occupational health office up there. But seeing that Mare Island was not going to be around much longer, it was pretty obvious at that point. I took a job at University of California, Berkeley campus, and worked there for a number of years before moving on to the university-operated Lawrence Livermore National Lab for about 17 years, and then finally 10 years at the still university-operated Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. So I've been I retired from Lawrence Berkeley and I retired from the university after 31 years, 8 years ago. So I had time to work on projects. And one of the projects that kind of came up was I wanted to learn a little bit more about where I lived in Castro Valley. I've always been interested in history of local history, of local areas. And there have been at least 4 books published that detail the history of Castro Valley. But, you know, I went to one presentation one time and I had 3 questions and the speaker couldn't answer any of my questions. And I thought, geez, it seems like, you know, there's a lot of information yet that could be derived. Anyway, so I'm going to describe here what turned out to be a 4-year effort to gather as much information as possible about the history of Castro Valley, trying to answer the questions not only of what happened, but trying to answer the questions of why they happened, why things happened, when they happened. And it turns out that pretty much everything, you know, there's a clear-cut reason for why they happened, when they happened. And, you know, I started this project in mid-2019, and it turned out to be a really good project when the pandemic occurred, because most of it, not all of it, but most of it could be done from my office in my house, and getting stuff emailed to me from libraries and from historical societies, contacting descendants of old timers and things like that. Most of it could be done without having to risk catching COVID. So it was a good project as it turned out for that purpose. Plus, the last history of Castro Valley was written about 20 years ago, before there was really a modern internet. And I got to thinking maybe maybe I can get some more information now that we have a much more advanced, much more sophisticated internet. I want to start with a land acknowledgement, recognizing that we gather here, the folks that are here, we gather in Fremont on the ethno-historic tribal territory of the Ohlone people, a particular sub-tribe of the Ohlone people that occupied this area. It's different up in Castro Valley, who were the direct ancestors of the people enrolled in the Molequa Ohlone tribe, who are striving for federal recognition. So anything I can do to help them achieve federal recognition, I would like to do. They have been somewhat helpful, actually, in my historical research. Also give a little credit to the historians of Castro Valley that came before me. Harry Bradford, John Sandoval, Dr. Martin Smith, Grace Niemczek, and Lucille Lorge. And she's the only one still around. She's the only one still with us. And she wrote the last Castro Valley history book back, I think it was 2003, so 20 years ago. Okay, today's presentation, there's going to be two parts. One is going to be the genesis of the project, how it turned from a 1-month effort into a 4-year effort. And my discovery of the historical resources that are available to people now in the modern internet era. And we'll take a break after part 1, but in between, in shorter periods of time, they're going to notify me and we'll answer any questions that come up. And then the second part of the talk will be the rise and fall of Don Guillermo Jose Castro, who was the rancho owner that was deeded the land that included Castro Valley and Hayward and those areas back in 1843. We've known forever that he was the rancho owner, but it turns out the details of how he got the rancho and how he lost the rancho are vastly more complicated and intricate and took a lot longer than prior histories would lead you to believe. This picture, you see this image here, seated on the right is Guillermo Castro. That's his son Luis to the left. This photo was acquired by the Bancroft Library in 2014. And they inventoried it, so I was able to find it online in their inventory, but they had never shelved it. It was apparently still sitting in a box somewhere. So when I contacted them during the pandemic and said, I'd like a scan of that, they said, no, we don't scan it until it's been shelved. But then I ran sort of a little scam with John Christian from the Hayward Area Historic Society. And between the two of us, we got them to scan it and send it to us. So this picture didn't exist, wasn't in the public before now. This is the first publication of the picture of Guillermo Castro. There's a painting of him that you'll see later, but this is the first photograph of him that's ever been published. And again, it only recently came to light as it was acquired by the Bancroft Library at the University of California. Around them is a superimposition of the two maps of the Rancho San Lorenzo that Castro got in 1843. The first map, we'll talk about this much more later on. His rancho was confirmed in 1858, but it took 6 years to come up with the final map because of some things we'll talk about later. This is superimposition of the two maps. The areas in red were areas that were deleted between 1858 and 1864. The areas in green were areas that were added between the two generations of those maps. So that's a little bit of the history of that particular image. All right. The part 1, genesis of the project and resources for history research in the modern internet era. So the genesis of the project was supposed to only last about a month. And the goal was very simple. This is my house with the bougainvillea in full bloom at 18736 Brickell Way in Castro Valley. I wanted to develop what's called a residential genealogy for the home that my wife, Kim, and I have lived in for the last 31 years. So residential genealogy used to be called a chain of title. In other words, I wanted to track down every owner of the land I live on all the way back to land namesake Guillermo Castro. Okay, it seemed to me that I would either succeed or fail in about a month. And I certainly wasn't sure I could do this, but I thought, in a month I'll know, what the deal is. I knew that we were the 6th owners of the house because the people from whom we bought the house told us that. They said, you're number 6. So they had figured out the first 5. So I figured that part wouldn't be that hard. It's true, it's not that hard. But then before that, I figured it might be hard. Turned out not to be hard. Turned out to be really easy. But anyway, so that was the genesis of the project. I just wanted to find out all the owners of the land back to Guillermo Castro. Then there was a slight increase in the scope of the project when I looked around the neighborhood and I saw the roads were named after people. We live on Brickell Way. The road by the side of our house is Haley Drive in my neighborhood. Just up from us is Elrod Drive, and just below is Mancini Drive. So I said, well, let me add to this project, see if I can't figure out who Brickell, Elrod, Mancini, and Haley were, that all these streets are named after. See, this neighborhood I knew dated from 1949. And so I figured, maybe we can find something on that. I had a little clue at the bottom left, number 3 there. You see, that's the blueprint of the house when it was originally designed for Mr. and Mrs. Robert F. O'Neill, Robert and Mary F. O'Neill back in 1949. And it's a little hard to see, but if you look closely on the left side where the arrow points out, you can see that it's approved. It says, OK, M.W. Haley. And Haley, of course, is the name of the road that goes by the side of our house. I said, whoever this M.W. Haley was, he must have been involved somehow in developing the neighborhood. So that's my first clue that I came across in coming up with the names of the roads in my neighborhood. So that was my whole project. That was the whole thing. I figured succeed or fail, and after a month, and then I'd go on and do something else. Everything changed the day I came across this website. My expected effort turned into a month, turned into 4 years because of this one thing. In 2017, I believe, Alameda County put all of its maps, all of its property maps, all of its road maps, all of its rancho maps, all of its subdivision maps, everything they have, all the way back to 1853 online. And if you can navigate their arcane database system, you can find maps going back to 1853, back to when the area was populated only by people squatting in different areas. Original road maps going back to 1853. There was no Alameda County before 1853. The entire East Bay was Contra Costa County until March 25th, I believe, 1853, when Alameda County was carved out of Santa Clara, a little bit of Santa Clara, mostly out of Contra Costa County. But this map, when I started digging into this, I found all this untapped information. I said, this is a gold mine of historical information that's never been worked before. So I set about to dig. Here's one of the interesting maps I came across early on. This is Redwood Road in Castro Valley. Redwood Road was the first new road built in Castro Valley. It actually runs north-south. It's sideways here. It was built to haul lumber out from the redwood trees behind Oakland up around Moraga. And you can haul them up and over the hill. They had a road to do that, but that was pretty torturous. And a lot of the redwood lumber for 10 years, as long as the redwoods held out, came out through Castro Valley on what was called Redwood Road. Well, what is now called Redwood Road. They had many different names for it in the past. This is actually the second survey. The first survey was done in 1865. This was the second survey 2 years later. And I show this for a couple of different reasons. First of all the farmers you see along here, Proctor, Kelly, Brickell, which is misspelled, Maddox, Jameson, Kennedy, all those people started as squatters in Castro Valley. All the prior histories of Castro Valley made no mention of squatters. But just like in the other areas, just like in the San Leandro area, just like down here in the Fremont area, all the first occupants were squatters. There were hundreds of squatters filling the alluvial, primarily not so much the mountains, but the flat areas in between, of which Castro Valley was one of them. In fact, there were no squatters in Castro Valley until they built Redwood Road. And then the first squatters showed up. The first squatters that showed up in town were the Jamesons, you can see on this map, and their stepfather, Zachariah Hughes at the bottom, Z. Hughes. They filed their claims with Contra Costa County, because Alameda didn't exist yet, in November of 1852. So they were the first squatters in town. So anyway, this map is from 1867. By that point, everybody either owned the land outright or most of them had mortgages. Probably at this point, all these folks had mortgages. Atherton, we'll talk about him later. He was the successor to Guillermo Castro, so he owned almost all of the rancho after 1863. We'll talk about that later on. One thing that's notable here is that you notice that they plot the Kennedy house and the Jameson house. The red arrows point to their houses along Redwood Road in 1867. If you go and look online and you put in Brickell, the road I live on, and you put in Castro Valley, you come up with this plaque, which is on a schoolhouse in Castro Valley. And it says that the first schoolhouse in Castro Valley was built on Brickell's land in 1866. And I have a whole nother presentation that I do that show that's totally bunk.
That plaque was put up in 1862 by Brickell's granddaughter, and is based entirely on family lore and had no actual evidence that it was there. And you can see if there was a school on the Brickell property next to the road where the school was, it would have showed up on this 1867 map, and it's not there. And there's all sorts of other information to say that the one and only historic landmark in Castro Valley is fake. So that's kind of unfortunate. I contacted the people that run the historic landmark process for the state of California. They sent me the whole 1962 application, and I got to go through it line by line, and almost every point they make is demonstrably wrong. So anyway, so that's the reason I showed this map. There are many, many other maps of Castro Valley that show, in many cases, show squatters before they even bought their land. Okay, oops, wrong button. No, that's right, that's the right button. Okay. Among the other maps that you find are the official county cadastral maps. Now, a cadastral map is a map that shows the large landowners. And the county issued official maps in 1874, 1878, and all the other years that you can see here. And they gave up after 1924. They didn't issue any more official cadastral maps after 1924. Now, all the original farmers we saw had been squatters. But as they either died or retired and moved away, they ended up selling their lands, which they had gotten very cheaply, typically $25 or $30 an acre. They sold their lands mostly to rich guys. Okay, it turns out that a series of rich folks moved into town in the 1870s and 1880s and bought up about a third of Castro Valley. Here we see three of them outlined. James Harvey Strobridge, he bought 500 acres in 1871 and 1872, and he made his money. He was the primary superintendent on building the western half of the Transcontinental Railroad. Okay, and as soon as he was done with that, they brought him to the East Bay to finish the connection from Niles Canyon to Oakland. That was in 1869. And as soon as he finished that last part, he went up to Castro Valley and bought 500 acres from two different retiring farmers. Well, one guy had died, the other guy retired. And he had about 500 acres as shown there in South Castro Valley. Right next to him, his business partner, also a railroader, also building the Transcontinental Railroad, Michael Stanton, bought about 400 acres. Here, this map from 1889 shows Mary Stanton owning it because Michael Stanton had already died by that point. Up north, in the far north in purple here, we see land is owned by Nathan and Emmeline Bradley. It's owned by them, but they never lived there. Or at least Nathan never did. Emmeline may have lived there when she was old. They were the parents of Elizabeth Parsons. And more or less, they bought the land as a wedding gift for the Parsons. And actually, they continued to own it until 1901 when they finally turned it over to Elizabeth. Any case, so their money came from lumbering in Michigan. It turns out far more money was made by lumbering in Michigan in the 1850s, and the 1860s, and 1870s than was made by all the gold mines in California. So there was a tremendous amount of lumber money, and the diaspora from that spread out all over the country. So anyway, it was the Bradleys, really though, the Parsons, that owned this huge 380-acre tract in northern Castro Valley. Right next to them, a relative, an aunt of Elizabeth Parsons, Mary Ann Van Hooser, bought 254 acres. They too made their money lumbering in Michigan, and they had a large lumbering plant that burned out twice. And I think they got fed up and they said, "We're getting out of here," and they moved to California, and they set up fruit farming instead of lumbering in California. Here we see the residual Brickell farm, which is just below the Van Hooser farm, is owned by the daughters, two of the daughters now, because both the Brickels had died before 1889. So the second generation of Castro Valley, not only these folks, but a lot of other folks were well-to-do people. A lot of businessmen from Oakland and particularly San Francisco decided to build country homes, and Castro Valley was a good place to build a country home. So the second generation of people in Castro Valley, who were there primarily because now they were growing fruit, which is a much more bucolic thing to do than grow oats, had moved to Castro Valley. All right. Oops, keep pressing the wrong button. Now, Strobridge was, as I said, he was the superintendent that built the western half of the Transcontinental Railroad. He had about 500 acres, and he was one of the earlier people. Well, he was right about on time when he transitioned from growing grains to growing fruit, as all of all of California, really, certainly Castro Valley. Most of Castro Valley transitioned from growing grains to fruit in the 1870s and 1880s. He switched over he had a huge pear orchard, hundreds of acres in pears in 1882. And then for some reason, in 1884, he decided to subdivide his 500-acre rancho and sell it off in lots of, the smallest lot was about 10 acres. The biggest was 100. And he put it all online, all on auction. And it's very weird because we have multiple reports of them selling everything, but none of the people that were reported to buy it on the auction day actually went through with the deal. So I don't know how to explain that. In the book, I talked about that in some detail. But eventually, in the following months, he did sell off a large portion of his rancho, even though he continued to live there for the rest of his life on the 100-acre lot that he retained. Okay. Here's in the red circle, you see James Harvey Strobridge in probably the most famous photograph, maybe the most famous historical photograph in the United States. It's reproduced in probably all, grade school history books. This is the joining of the eastern and the western halves of the Transcontinental Railroad in Promontory, Utah on May 10th, 1869. And there he is in the background circled, shaking hands with his counterpart on the eastern half, the Union Pacific, or the Union half of the railroad. There's a famous painting, and he stands here with the shovel next to Leland Stanford, who's the big guy in the middle. And his wife, he actually traveled with his wife and at least two adopted children along the railroad as they were building it. And you can see behind Leland Stanford, you can see his wife. Oops. I guess I gotta do it this way. This is his wife back here, and here's his kids. Here's his kids standing right there. If you can see the lasers, you can see that. In any case, Strobridge has been dramatized for TV at least 3 different times. Here's the first time in 1986 on the BBC. We have audio? Oh, well, we don't have audio. Okay, well, we'll skip these. It's just this is showing that he had been dramatized 3 times on television, including the most recent one was on Hell on Wheels season 5. So if you want to watch Hell on Wheels season 5, they have him in there. It is not historically accurate. They introduce a fake figure that takes on his achievements, and it's kind of sad. But nevertheless, there he is, Jim Strobridge, standing with a pickaxe handle, which was his persuader for people that disagreed with his policies. The project got launched when I found that there was this massive repository of maps. But then slowly but surely, I discovered all these other resources that were available, some in person, most of them you could access remotely one way or the other. The Hayward Area Historical Society is sort of my home base historical society. And of course, they provided probably 75 pictures for the book. So they were very useful. Also other historical societies, including Washington Township, because you had some newspapers that have been put on archive.org, which were valuable. Libraries and archives. There's actually a fair amount of historical material in the Castro Valley Library. The only problem is the library doesn't know they have it. I paid $500 to get UC Riverside to digitize some the Castro Valley newspapers from the old days, and it turns out they had the microfilm in the Castro Valley Library all along. Now they didn't know they had it, so they couldn't have told me that they had it. And besides, they don't have a microfilm reader, so it was still worth it paying the $500 to get it digitized. Actually, the Walnut Creek Library has this huge genealogical library. I got several good resources out of there. UC Santa Barbara offers aerial photos back to 1931 in Castro Valley, 1928 in other areas. And some of these other things we'll look at as we go through. Old newspapers, other sources of old maps, ancestry research. So we'll take a look at some of the examples of this as we go through. Here is an example of the UC Santa Barbara aerial photo collection. On the left, you see a map of Castro Valley with a bunch of round colored dots on it. Each dot corresponds to an aerial photo of Castro Valley. The darker red the dot is, like dark red you see sort of along the left side, those are as old as 1931. And so for those parts of Castro Valley, you can get aerial photos going back to 1931. If you go right along the coast, which of course Castro Valley doesn't, but if you do that, you can find aerial photos back to 1928. And all you have to do is click on these And most of them just pop right up on your computer in high resolution. So it's really good. A few of them had never been scanned, so I had to pay 20 bucks a piece to get them scanned. But once I paid 20 bucks a piece, they're there for everybody else to use too. So that's kind of nice. The first aerial photo of all of Castro Valley was 1939, and that's what's shown over on the right. And as you can kind of see, it was still pretty rural in 1939. So this is throughout the entire state of California. There must be hundreds of thousands of aerial photos, and all you got to do is pick the color that you want. Yellow means pretty recent, dark red means old. Click on it, and the photo downloads to your computer. There's also historicalaerial.com. They offer aerial photos every few years from 1946 and on. You get to view them, but if you want to download them, you got to pay, but it's not that expensive. It's pretty reasonably priced. Here's an example of an aerial photo from 1939. So this is the first aerial photo of all of Castro Valley. And this is the Parsons property. Remember, we looked at that earlier in North Castro Valley. It was by this point, Elizabeth Parsons had died. And she had eventually got the property from her mother. And so this ended up belonging to her kids by this point because Elizabeth was dead. And all these little dots you see where it says Castro Valley Orchards, each dot is a fruit tree, because originally half of the property was for fruit and half of it was for dairy. By this point, they'd given up the dairy and they were trying as hard as they could to give up the orchard, but they couldn't sell the land. There was a round thing in the middle of the ranch that had some buildings attached to it. And for the life of me, and that zoomed in on number 2 there, is zoomed in on that round thing. I could not figure out what the heck that round thing is. I overlaid it with a modern map, and it's where a park is there now. But what the heck is that round thing? Until I found an 1898 article that described it. What this was a fruit drying field surrounded by a miniature railroad. And what they would do is they would put the fruit in the railroad and bring it up to the building at the top. And in the building at the top, they would apply sulfur to it, which was their preservative. And then they would bring it down, lay it out in the fields. You can kind of see it here, laid out in the field to dry. And when they were done drying it, they would put it in the building at the bottom, which would then be trucked out for sale as dried fruit. So this was a fruit drying apparatus. And eventually this land was used for a school in the 1950s in Castro Valley. And more recently, just about 20 years ago, it got converted into a really nice park. So it's now Parsons Park. So I was really afraid I would never figure out what that was, but I did finally figure out what that was. That's about almost 400 acres in the area of that rancho. Another thing you could do on numerous resources, I use mostly Ancestry.com, but there are FamilySearch.org. There's Jenny, which is really good. There's a bunch of different things you can do online where you can track people down. And so let's keep looking at the Parsons here. I used Ancestry.com, but again, there's other resources that you can use. As we said, Elizabeth Parsons' wealthy stepfather bought the newlyweds 380 acres in north central Castro Valley in 1887. And Elizabeth actually came into owning it from her mother in 1901. And she owned it until she died. And so people that live in that neighborhood refer to their neighborhood as the Parsons Estate neighborhood. To this day, they still refer to it as Parsons Estate neighborhood. And then also on Ancestry.com, I tracked down the great-granddaughter of the Parsons, and she gave me this family photo of the Parsons from somewhere probably around 1925. And you can see Isaac Parsons and his wife Elizabeth in the middle, and that's the whole extended family surrounding them. The kid sitting in the chair on the left, that was this woman who gave me the photo. That was her father. So tracking down descendants was one of my favorite things to do. And descendants very often, not always, but very often had photos and sometimes had stories that they could give you as well. Let's take a look at Isaac. So here's the family tree for Isaac Brown Parsons and Elizabeth Gaylord. Isaac Parsons was actually born to pretty much not wealthy farmers in upstate New York. But when his mother died, he was sent to live with his wealthy uncle, also called Isaac Parsons, who had made his money in lumbering in Michigan. And that totally changed the trajectory of his life. He ended up going to Annapolis and becoming an officer in the Navy for a little while. Then they kicked him out when there was Congress hadn't given them enough money to have any new officers. Actually, there's a long story about that in the book. It's an interesting thing. But let's take a look. They had 4 children. Joseph Lamson, that was actually Elizabeth's child from her first marriage. Emmeline, Helen, and Alfred Parsons. So they had 4 children out of that, and had a fifth child that was stillborn. And when they were subdividing their property, they ended up naming most of the roads after I don't know if it's the spouses of the Parsons kids or maybe the married names of the Parsons kids. So Emmeline Parson married Douglas Parker, and sure enough, there's a Parker Road there in Castro Valley. Helen Parsons married Howard Reamer, and there you see Reamer Road in Castro Valley. Dorothy Ewing married Alfred B. Parsons, and so there is a Ewing Road in Castro Valley. And of course, Joseph Lamson, Elizabeth's son by the first marriage. So there's a Lamson Road in Castro Valley. So really just the map sort of reflects the family that owned the territory. Let's take a closer look at Joseph Lamson and Eleanor Baldwin, his wife, because it's kind of interesting. So Joseph Lamson, he became a high-powered attorney in San Francisco. And he married Eleanor Baldwin, and they had three daughters, Flora Lamson, Baldwin Lamson, and Elizabeth Lamson. Flora Lamson married a guy named William Hewlett. You've probably heard of him, Hewlett Packard. So she turned out to be one of the wealthiest people in the whole United States. Apparently, they were a little worried because, of course, they got married long before he founded Hewlett Packard. Was this guy got a chance? You know, there was some concern expressed. Elizabeth Lamson, she married Bud Hughes, was co-founder of Hexcel Corporation. Last I checked, it was worth $8 billion. And then the son, Baldwin Lamson, became one of the first professors at the new School of Medicine at UC Los Angeles. And so he was professor of pathology and laboratory medicine. So I would say that the Lamson kids, they did okay. They made out okay. Of the kids, only of the Parsons kids, only one stayed in farming, and that was Helen Parsons Reamer and her husband Howard Baldy Reamer. Apparently, they called him Baldy. Isaac Parsons, he was trying desperately to get out of Castro Valley after 1910. He tried for 2 decades to sell his land, but he couldn't get anybody to buy it because he was investing heavily up in the Delta, where he was with a group called the Netherlands Company, I think, that was reclaiming land up in the Delta, which was very rich farmland. He bought something like 1,000 acres up there and reclaimed it. And to this day, his descendants, fifth generation descendants, still farm at Reamer Farms up in the Delta. So you can find their website. They've got a website, which is where I got these pictures from. Jamie Reamer is I think the fifth generation of Reamers to farm that farm to this day. One of the other things you get when you go into these like Ancestry.com or other resources is you get access to the old censuses. So here on the top left is the 1852 California census, which I think is probably the only California census that was ever actually completed. And we see the Hughes family, who I mentioned earlier, with the first squatters in Castro Valley. And here's their picture. Over on the right-hand side, you see Zachariah Hughes, his wife Permelia, and his daughter Martha. And I got this picture from their great-great-granddaughter, who I forget how I tracked her down, but I tracked her down somehow. She lives in Alamo, California. I was able to get this photo of them. And then the Hayward Area Historical Society provided the photo of Permelia's son and Zacharias Hughes' stepson, John William Jameson, who was also a squatter along with his brother in Castro Valley. They all squatted on the west side of Redwood Road at the same time in 1852. So they were the only people in Castro Valley in the 1852 census. In the 1860 census, Castro Valley is full of mostly squatters, but a couple of landowners. So here we see the Hughes and the Jamesons. By this point, they had purchased their land. They purchased the land from Castro in 1856, and then Hughes sold a chunk of it to his stepson in 1859. And here you see the two houses. Most of the Hughes family lived in one house. And then there was a second house where John William Jameson lived, along with, I think, 13 laborers and probably a bunkhouse kind of arrangement. So this was, you can see, it must have been a pretty big farm. It was 500 acres because they had, I think this is 13 folks from Germany, Peru, Ireland, Portugal, Sweden, a wide diversity of farmhands working on the farm there. Yeah, so Hughes, when he bought his 488 acres from Castro in 1856, got it for $25 an acre, so a pretty good deal. Oops. The other thing you get in the early years in the 1860 and 1880s, you get the agricultural censuses. So you can find, here I list some of the major farmers in 1860, 1870, and 1880, and what they were raising on their farms. And of course, in 1860, except for the Jamesons and most of those folks up there, half of the folks up there anyway, were still squatting. The other half had actually purchased their land. People were growing primarily grains, not just in Castro Valley, but throughout California. I read a book on the history of Davis, California, and the same transitions from grains to fruit happened really throughout Northern California. And the arrows show nobody was growing fruit in Castro Valley in the 1860 or 1870 census. But by the time we get to 1880, people are starting to do a little bit of fruit. Take a look at the bottom line. That's William Knox. This picture there is on the right. He was originally a sheep raiser, and he raised grain and sheep, but he transitioned to raising fruit before anybody else did. He had a 50-acre farm, and he made $6,000. Compare that to Brickell with a 170-acre farm, and he made $2,000 that year. Or let's say McDonald, 400-acre farm, and he made $2,500. So the money was in fruit, and by 1880, everybody knew that. And so very quickly, they were tearing up everything as quickly as they could in Castro Valley to put in fruit trees. This is just a collection of some of the photos of mostly of descendants that I tracked down. Obituaries are a great thing because they often list the names of all the kids, and they sometimes list their married names. And you can find old obituaries in newspapers, and obituaries over the last 30 years you can usually find online. And there's one other advantage. If you were in historical research, if you were born in California, odds are extremely high that you live the rest of your life in California. When I'm tracking down descendants, 95 times out of 100, if they were born in California, I found them in California. That wouldn't be true in a lot of the other parts of the country, but that eased. If the name was really unusual, it was easy. If the name was pretty common, well, at least I knew they had to be in California. So anyway, these are just some of the photos that I tracked down from various descendants, and there's lots more that are present in the book. All the old mission records have been digitized now. So if you want to know who the first Native American was who was baptized at the mission, San Jose, or any of the other missions, you can look it up online on the Huntington Early Population Database. Here is the record for Guillermo Castro's baptism. And on this one page, I learned when he was born. I learned his middle name. Almost nowhere else will you find his middle name. He never used it. Very unusual. A lot of these Mexican folks had 4 and 5 names. He never used his middle name, Jose, but he was, as I think it showed, Guillermo Jose Castro here. I figured out where he was baptized, Mission San Juan Bautista. Where he was born on his grandfather's rancho. His father's name, Carlos Castro. His father was baptized in Sonora, Mexico, actually. He was 2 years old when he was carried by the De Anza expedition all the way from Mexico to Northern California. He was 2 years old, and they made that trip, and they ended up with more people than they left with because a couple of women had babies. A remarkable thing. I'm surprised has never been made into a movie. His mother's maiden name, his mother's baptism, his grandparents, and his ethnicity. And under ethnicity, he's listed as Razan. And Razan means he's a person able to reason, which means he's not a Native American. So that's one of their class dividers that they used back in New Spain in those days. Anyway, so tremendous. I went through and I looked up all of the Native Americans that were baptized in the first year of the Mission San Jose, and a bunch of them came from up in the Castro Valley area, so that's kind of interesting. You can look it all up here. We already talked about that. I got this 1857, that's the first Alameda County map from the David Rumsey Map Library at Stanford University. Tremendous resource. They have lots of maps, and you're allowed to reproduce them as long as you don't reproduce them as maps to sell. You can reproduce them at will, and it doesn't cost you anything. Some of these, like the cover photo on my book, cost me $300 to buy permission to reproduce that. Fortunately, the Rumsey maps were free. It turns out 5 people wrote books about or were written about squatting on Castro's Rancho. So I was able to either get hard copies or get electronic copies of all of these books. California 46 to 88 is a real, even in its time, I found a review, a review in a professional journal in 1888, and they liked the book back in 1888. It's a really great book about, he worked down here by the mission in 47, 48, after they put down the Mexicans rebellion. He worked down here, then he moved up and he started Squattersville. You probably, if you heard of Squattersville, which is later became San Lorenzo, then later became San Leandro. He was the founder of Squattersville, and he wrote a really nice book. Anyway, he talks about it, Genealogy and Recollections by A.A. Moore, who still owns property. His descendants still own property just east of Fremont. Some annals of the Powers family. A Woman's Overland Journal of California was a later republication of something that was originally published in 1858. Memory pictures. This is a picture of Mrs., the wife of John Hyde Braley. You saw her picture as a young woman just a few slides back in the top left-hand corner, standing between her parents. That's her in about 1861. And that picture on the lower left is a picture of her in 1911. So anyway, Moore, he wrote about squatting in Castro Valley. And so this was very helpful to actually have firsthand accounts of the experience. And most of these were accessed either through Google Books, Hathi, Trust, or archive.org. Archive.org is this remarkable resource online. And I got copies of about half of these. I was able to acquire hard copies of about half of these. Actually, 3 out of 5 I got hard copies of. One of the other things I did, which nobody had ever done in Castro Valley before, was I spent hours in the Alameda County and Contra Costa Recorder's Office digging out the sales records of property transactions. And so here on the right-hand side, we have what I call first purchasers of land in and around Castro Valley. These are people that either bought land directly from Guillermo Castro or from his successor in interest, Faxon Atherton, who we'll talk about later on. So all the records before 1920 are hand scribbled and so barely legible. The indices are faded. You mostly can't read the indices. So if you want to find the records, you go page after page after page through these hand scrawled notes and try to find them. To Contra Costa County's credit, the squatter records, remember, Castro Valley was part of Contra Costa County before 1853. The squatter records have been digitized and are readily available in Contra Costa County. Alameda County, after a great effort on my part, has admitted they either lost or threw away their squatter records. So all the Alameda County squatter records are gone. Yeah, question.
Would this be a good time to ask about the prominence of Faxon Atherton?
Well, we're going to get to him later.
Okay.
We will talk about Faxon Atherton in some detail later on. We have his picture later on. So yeah, so Faxon owned everything after 1863, and he sold land until he died after he had a wayward tooth extraction that got infected. And after that, his estate continued selling off land until it was all sold off about mid 1880s. So it took a long time. He got the land in 1863. He still owned land until the mid 1880s. And we will talk about Faxon Atherton up ahead. Too bad, though, Alameda County has lost their squatter records. They've ended up, well, we'll talk about that later. Here, in fact, we talk about it right here. One of the things I had to do was extract information from Alameda County. And it turns out that they're not very used to getting questions about resources from just Joe Blow out in the street. I would call them or I would email them and asking for things like the first zoning map for Castro Valley, 1951, and they would ignore me. Finally, somebody said, well, you got to file like a Freedom of Information Request Act. In California, that's called the California Open Records Act. So I went online and I figured out how to do that. It's not hard. And you file a California Information Records Act, and they have to respond within 10 days. They're supposed to respond within 10 days, and almost everybody did. So I've learned that if I want records from some component of Alameda County, don't waste your time calling, just file one of these Freedom of Information Request Acts. To their credit, the East Bay Regional Park District didn't require that. The County Public Works didn't require that, and Castro Valley Sanitary District didn't require that. So they responded. I contacted our representative for the Park District, and he put me in touch with a woman who was very helpful as part of the Park District. So it was not easy getting stuff. Sometimes it's like pulling, I just wanted this one map, and it took me weeks. Anyway, so now is a break. So if there's any questions, or people need to take a quick bathroom break.
Jim, do you have any questions?
Look at half my banana.
More experience than we do about.
Oh, yeah, oh, yeah. Yeah, I have to, I didn't realize. that, I can get the towel.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I know. Where it is. Oh,
Don't we have a clean spot? Thank you.
have you presented the talk to other places?
I've presented other talks to other places. This is the first time I've presented this particular talk.
Oh, okay. Cause I'm sure other people in Castro Valley would be interested.
Next Sunday, I do the same talk at the Castro Valley Library.
Oh.
And I did,
Because you guys are considering incorporating?
well, they just decided yet again that it's impossible.
Oh, they have?
Yes, as of 15 days ago, 14 days ago,
Incorporating what?
incorporating Castro Valley.
As a city, because it's.
The book has 28 pages on the history of incorporating Castro Valley. And but writing it now, there'll be a 29th page.
Will you be talking about that?
No, I don't talk about the incorporation.
Okay, well, I'm curious, how did it, who decided?
Who decides? Well, ever since the 1960s, actually, the history of the incorporation from San Leandro down is really interesting. It was pretty simple, actually, in Fremont, Newark. It was not that complicated. But up there, it was absolute chaos. There were hundreds of different proposals floating around. And before 1955, you could have competing proposals competing for the same land, all running at the same time. It was absolute chaos. Then in 1955, in July 1955, they made it, if you were trying to incorporate this area, then nobody else could go there until at least 50 days. and you got this little window. But then in 1960s, they created the LAFCOs, Local Agency Formation Commissions. And now the LAFCOs have to approve all attempts to annex or incorporate. So the LAFCO just paid for a study of Castro Valley. And they said we're $7 million short of what we would need to incorporate Castro Valley, which is same as it's ever been. So
Who has the money? I mean, what money is there?
well, property taxes, property taxes, sales taxes, all the taxes that are,
Will come into.
yeah. But it's 7 million shy of where it needs to be. And in the book, I explained that that was caused by the way they allowed Castro Valley to be turned into all houses immediately after the war. There was a part of Castro Valley that could have been used for industry and retail, but before you could blink an eye, it was all built up with houses. And there was no place left then to put either industry, industry supported San Lorenzo, for example, the great success story was San Leandro, because they had all this industry that came out of Oakland right after the war. And so their property taxes were 60% of what they were paying in Castro Valley because industry was paying all the property tax. Castro Valley had none of that. And that's the main reason that they've never been able to incorporate Castro Valley. And you know what? Everybody knew what by 1945, everybody knew what the game was going to be after the war. Hayward and San Leandro had done these comprehensive studies, and they knew exactly what was going to happen after the war. Industry was going to flow in, and people were going to follow it. And they took extreme steps to try to protect land for industry. But Castro Valley was not protected, just part of the county. And
none of them tried to conclude with that.
Hayward tried to take part. Like I said, 28 pages in the book about that.
You had the bean cherry and the cherry lamb.
Cherryland.
It's called Mercy, right?
Don't know about Murray.
No, I thought it was.
Murray Township.
Oh, Murray.
Oh, Murray Township. That was. It used to be the township east of Livermore, that area. Not
It's the Tri-Valley.
Yeah, right.
Which is all.
And everything, all that, probably 500 square miles up there.
Where did the name Ashland come from?
Is a question I've asked many times and I've been unable to answer. It existed as early as 1874. But I have been unable, originally, back in the 1850s, that area was called San Lorenzo. It was part of San Lorenzo. But somewhere along the line, very shortly thereafter, the name Ashland showed up. I thought it was maybe linked to a particular subdivision, but it's not. I have been unable to figure out what the name Ashland is. And I tried too. Yeah, let's crank it up again. You ready? Are we live again? I guess we are. Okay. Maybe hit the lights in here. Yeah. Okay, great. I never turned it on. So we've been going out. This is how people get in trouble, right? They don't realize they're still going out. My son's wife worked for the school district where that happened, and they were talking, not knowing they were being broadcast, and the whole school board had to resign because they were so critical of the parents. Okay, so part 2, and I call this the rise and fall of Don Guillermo Castro. Okay, and it actually covers a little bit more than that, but we'll go through this pretty quickly. Now, as everybody knows, probably everybody that's attending this is aware that this land used to be owned by the various Ohlone tribes, East Bay, and a lot of San Francisco Peninsula and south of there was occupied by Ohlone tribes. Castro Valley was actually occupied by a combination of different tribes, but and they lived the way they lived for thousands of years until the Spanish showed up. Spanish first made trips into the East Bay starting in the 1760s, but they didn't set up a permanent facility until 1797, when they set up the Mission San Jose, which is about a 3-wood away from where I'm sitting here right now. And there we see on the left, we see the only nice image I could find of the Mission San Jose in its prime. This was drawn, I believe, in 1826. Is that what it says there? Yeah. And this is an image that's I modified the image somewhat to make it more visible, but it's an image that's kept in the Bancroft Library at the University of California at Berkeley. Anyway, so the Mission San Jose job, we'll talk about that a little bit later when we get down to it. The mission was essentially, it was desecularized. In other words, it was control of the mission was taken over by the state, by the Mexican government from the priests in 1863. Okay, that's called secularization. We'll talk about that more later on. Then finally, after years of trying, the governor, Mitchell Trina, I think is how it's pronounced, he gave Guillermo Castro, after 6 years of trying, granted Castro a rancho of about 27,000 acres. And Castro suffered, he did great for a few years. Then, of course, the Americans arrived and things were good for a while, but then they went downhill. In 1863, he sold out to a fellow by the name of Faxendine Atherton. If you recognize Atherton's name, it's probably because there's a city on the opposite side of the bay named for him. Okay, he was the first person who decided to build a 1 square mile property over on the West Bay. I think we called it Fair Oaks. I think that was what it was called in the beginning. But when they finally got around to building a city over there years later, they decided to name it after him. So that's Atherton. Atherton had come from New England, and as an 18-year-old, he sailed to Chile, which was really a hub of activity of trading in those days. And he worked as a trader for others in Chile, and he visited California in the 1830s, selling goods. He would bring goods up on a ship. He was the supercargo on the ship. Supercargo's job was to supervise the delivery and sale of cargo to the rancho owners, the Mexican rancho owners. And he decided he took a real liking to the place. And especially as the gold rush took off, he rapidly became very wealthy. He was actually pretty wealthy even before the gold rush. And finally, he decided to move to California in 1858. And as we'll see, he helped finance Guillermo Castro's various debts. In the end, Atherton bought the rancho from Guillermo Castro. There is a long accepted story that he obtained it through foreclosure. But as far as I can tell, that's incorrect. Anyway, so then Atherton hired his nephew, Charles Ward, shown by the arrow in the middle of that photograph taken in Hayward, to manage his rancho and turn his job. He had many jobs, but his main job was to turn squatters into buyers or renters. So even after Atherton bought the rancho, it was still full of squatters. There were dozens and dozens of squatters all over the place. So his nephew, Charles Ward, his job was to get rid of the squatters one way or the other. Either get them to buy, get them to rent, or get them the heck out of there using the courts. And that was his, he loved that job. And he wrote a brief history of his time, and he absolutely adored his time on the Rancho San Lorenzo. As I said, it was the best time of his entire life. He was forced to leave when 2 of his children died, and his wife, who was from Chile, demanded they move back there. He died. By that point, they were living back in New England. He died. He shipped his body all the way out to Hayward to be interred because he wanted to live forever on the Rancho San Lorenzo, or to exist forever on the Rancho San Lorenzo. Anyway, probably most people are aware that the East Bay was occupied by a couple of different Indian tribes, Native American tribes. Used to be called Costanoan. Now more often, the main group is called Ohlone. It's like Ohlone College just down the street here. And certainly down here in Fremont, it were various Ohlone tribes speaking various versions of the Ohlone language that lived in little villages down here. Up in Castro Valley was kind of split down the middle between Ohlone tribes and Miwok tribes. So it's generally assumed that the Native Americans that lived in the Castro Valley area, who were the Yaquen and the Yurgans, or the Urgans, probably had to be bilingual. The languages were not that different, I guess, so they could become bilingual. So those were the 2 tribes that lived in the Castro Valley area, the Yaquen and the Yurgan. In fact, the first woman, or maybe it was her child, I forget now. I think it was her child. The first child that was baptized at the Mission San Jose was a
a Jurgen child. That was the shtick in the early days of the mission, is get the children baptized and the parents would follow. That was sort of the early shtick on that. So anyway, these were the languages spoken in the East Bay. And of course, the missions, the Spanish built 21 missions up and down the coast. The only one in the East Bay was the Mission San Jose. They did compete with the South Bay Mission Santa Clara and the Mission Dolores in San Francisco, both of which had some of the action on recruiting Native Americans as well. Mission San Jose, again, was founded in 1797. And again, just around the corner from where I'm speaking from here in Fremont. Okay. It was kind of close to the Mission Santa Clara, much closer than you would typically expect the missions to be spaced. And it's not entirely, I've read a couple of explanations for that. It's not entirely clear why that was the case. By the time they set up the mission, actually, some of the local natives had already been moved to Mission Santa Clara. So the natives who had been moved to Mission Santa Clara, some of them were shipped back north to the Mission San Jose to seed the mission here as they brought in new people. And I think most people are aware of this, that it was the Native American labor that built the missions and built all the infrastructure. There was only 2 priests and a handful of soldiers associated with the mission. So all the labor was provided by the whatever particular brand of Native Americans they were recruiting at any given time. All the Castro Valley natives had been missionized by 1810. After that, they moved inland. Here we see the missionization areas of the different missions. And the light blue area is the area that was given to the Mission San Jose to recruit natives. In the South Bay, it was Mission Santa Clara. And actually, the San Francisco Mission Dolores had some action up around Oakland and north into the Richmond area. They actually had responsibility for that area for recruiting natives. And they'd already done a fair amount of that even before the Mission San Jose was created. This is a map drawn by Father Narciso Duran from 1824, and it's quite an interesting map. I added the blue color to make it clear that that represents the water around the bay. This is a map of the entire East Bay area going out all the way to the Central Valley. In the very middle of the map is a big flat area. That's the Val de San Jose, now the Livermore, Pleasanton, Dublin Valley. And in the little square that's enlarged to the right, that's the San Leandro, Castro Valley, Hayward area. And one of the things you can see is that there's a little circle with a cross on top of it. The little circle on the cross top of it indicates a Native American outpost. Now, most of the natives were actually moved to the mission. So hundreds and hundreds of Native Americans lived at the missions. But a certain amount of them lived in Native communities that were typically supporting ranches that the mission had in outlying areas. And there were 3 of them along the coast where today you find San Leandro, San Lorenzo, and Hayward. Okay, there was the Rancho San Leandro, there was the Rancho San Lorenzo, and there was a Rancho Con. That's abbreviated. It's unclear what that stands for. I've yet to find anybody that can tell me what Rancho Con's full name was. Anyway, I circled, or they're in a square and they're enlarged because those are the ranchos that were involved in the history of Castro Valley. Rancho San Leandro, Rancho San Lorenzo, and not so much the Rancho Con, but Rancho San Leandro and Rancho San Lorenzo. This is quite an interesting map. All throughout this, if you look at it carefully, all these little circles with a cross above it were missionized Indians. In a few areas way out in the Delta, there's just circles with no cross on top. Those were Indians that hadn't been missionized yet. Here's a drawing by the artist and author Joe Mora, used by permission, of an example of a mission of an outlying rancheria dwelling space. You see in the drawing, you see a few Indian houses there to the right, and an adobe building, and then a barn and an enclosed area. On the right-hand side is an actual 1841 map of the downtown Hayward area. Okay, and what you can see, and for those of you that can see the laser, up here we have the Casas de Rancho. Those are the same as these Indian houses over here. This is their garden. Okay, this is the Rancho San Lorenzo, which is the northern border of Hayward, because when they incorporated Hayward, they didn't want to pay for the bridges. So they do absolutely stay on the south side of Rancho San Lorenzo. So this is actually an 1841 map
of downtown Hayward. And this was submitted by Castro in one of his requests for a land grant. So most of the natives were relocated to the mission, but a fair number of them lived out in these outlying communities. Now, everything changed in 1821, and I don't think this is widely appreciated. Up until 1821, California was part of New Spain. Okay, Spain ruled the colonies. It was their colony, just like England had the colonies in the eastern United States. Spain had the colonies in Mexico and California. Alta California is what we call California now. But everything changed when finally they kicked the Spanish out in 1821. Now, of course, California didn't find out about it until 1822. All of a sudden, so it's important to understand everybody in California was dirt poor. There was no money for anybody. So there were no resources to fight over because nobody had anything. For years, the soldiers hadn't been paid because the Civil War was going on. The battle to free Mexico from New Spain took 10 years. So nobody had anything. And part of the reason for that is they had a mercantile system where the only trading that California could do would be to trade with Mexico or trade with Spain, so-called mercantilism. It's a word from grade school that I never understood until now. Anyway, so you took what they gave, and it wasn't much. All of a sudden, in 1822, anybody could show up with a ship and say, "What do you got to sell?" And I swear to you, within months, the Americans started showing up with ships saying, "Hey, we could use your cow hides to make leather, and we can use the fat from all your cows to make candles. So what do you think? What do you say we set up a deal?" Yeah, I mean, literally within months of New Spain disappearing and Mexico appearing, the Americans were showing up on the coast, setting up businesses to buy the so-called hide and tallow business. So that was the main thing. 95% of what the ranchos had, what the missions had to sell, and the ranchers had to sell, were hides and tallow. And there was big demand for it. You needed leather and you needed candles. There was no electricity in those days. The Native Americans on the still existing missions were put to work producing the hides and the tallow. Okay. And then later, once the missions wound down, a lot of the Native Americans just went to work for the rancho owners. So now all of a sudden, out of the dirt poor environment, a few rich guys started showing up. There was a handful of rancho grants early on. These weren't really grants. They were leases. The king said, yeah, you can set up a ranch there until you die. Okay, then it reverts back to the king. But these people had hide and tallow to sell. And all of a sudden, they started showing up and they started having big festivals, okay, fandangos and bullfights. And they started having all these employees working for them on the ranchos. And they like to wear a lot of bling. So the East Coast folks would bring a lot of sort of fancy, flashy cloth and gilt things and gold things and silver things. They sold very well among the people who had been dirt poor and now wanted to make it clear that they were no longer dirt poor. In other words, this was the beginning of conspicuous consumption in Northern California. And I think that the horses, that I read one article where they claimed that by the time the guy had finished dollying up his horse, it had $2,000 worth of stuff on the horse. And I think this was the origin of Pimp My Ride in the original Spanish. Chula me viaje, I guess is how you pronounce that. Anyway, so now all of a sudden, say, wait a minute, who is that guy that's got all that money over there? And how come those priests at the missions are getting all this money selling all the hides and tallow? So things changed rapidly after 1822. But it took a little while longer. It wasn't until 1828 that it became feasible to really give out rancho grants. But the real problem was the missions had all the good land. Okay, there was some land that the missions didn't claim, but most of the good land was owned by the missions. So by the time you get to the 1930s, you had all these people saying, well, I want some land because I want to be one of these rich ranch owners too. And these missions, they haven't done squat. The original plan was the mission would move into an area, missionize the natives, and then move on after about 10 years. And yet the missions had been in place for over 60 years, 3 generations, and that had never happened, not even once. The idea is when they left, they would leave behind a new town, a new pueblo, and the pueblo would have the natives running it.
The natives would run the saloon. The natives would run the, all the different things that you would have in a traditional Spanish town like that. And that hadn't happened in over 60 years. So everybody concluded, and I think rightly so, that the missions had failed in their primary assignment, which was to turn the natives into tax-paying Spanish and then later Mexican citizens. So there were two things working against the missions by the time you get to the 1830s. One, it had become possible to give out land, but the missions had all the good land. And two, everybody pretty much had decided it was time the missions had to go. So that's what happened. They started in 1833 to secularize missions. Secularize means they took control of them away from the fathers, the priests, and gave them to the governor, essentially, gave the land to the governor. And the governor still had to run the missions. And he would assign somebody to run the missions who typically did a very poor job compared to the way the fathers had run them. And there was actually a big audit of the missions. And there's a whole book written about that. It's very, very interesting. But it also made all the land available for granting to people. So the mission San Jose was the second to last mission to be secularized. It was secularized on the 29th of November, 1836. And that meant that the land was now in the hands of the governor, and the governor could give out grants. Okay. So three people showed up right away trying to get land in those ranchos along the coast that we talked about earlier, Rancho San Lorenzo and San Leandro. Guillermo Castro, Jose Joaquin Estudillo, and Francisco Soto, of whom there is no image, sadly. There's no picture, there's no painting of Francisco Soto. Those are the three guys that would spend the next 5 or 6 years fighting over land in the East Bay, up around Castro Valley, San Lorenzo, Hayward, San Leandro area. Here's a very nice map. This map was provided by Castro, I believe, in 1839, if not, I'm pretty sure this was from 1839. They kind of messed things up. The university did. They separated the maps from the other records. So it's a little hard to know exactly the date of these things, but pretty sure this is 1839. And this shows the entire East Bay. I've rotated it so that north is at the top. At the top is Castro Valley. You can see it looks like a little valley there. A, B, and C combined constituted the Rancho San Leandro. Okay. And you can see at the left, is the Estudillo Casa. Estudillo had already moved in there by 1838, and he had a house on the Rancho San Leandro already in 1838. And then we have Hayward. You see what we now call Mission Boulevard was there. Of course, it predates the Americans. And there's the Mission San Jose down at F, which is good because that could stand for Fremont. So this is the whole East Bay laid out in this really nice drawing as part of Castro's request for land in 1839. So Castro and his father applied for land in Rancho San Leandro 3 weeks after it was secularized. So they wasted no time. He and his father, all the applications that went in both in his name and his father's name, Carlos Castro, for whatever reason. So he applied for land in Rancho San Leandro, but so did Estudillo. 6 weeks after it was secularized, he applied for land in the same area, and he didn't waste any time. He moved there. He basically squatted there. So he said, well, I'm here now, possession is 9/10 the law, even in those days, I suppose. So that's the whole thing. So that's kind of a nice map. What came of it, because there was a conflict, they said they allowed the Castros to occupy about 1,000 acres. Nothing, right? 1,000 acres. And, Estudillo was already there, and they said, okay, you're already there, that's fine. But neither man received a grant because of their conflicting requests. And besides, the governor didn't want to be too hasty at giving away this very valuable land. The governor would make the grant after going through a process. And we'll talk about that. So the governor, he tried to intervene between Estudillo and Castro, and he couldn't get any solution. So he sent in his prefect, Jose Castro, who was a pretty distant relative to Guillermo Castro. And he told Jose Castro to figure it out or to make a recommendation that he would go with. Okay. In other words, he was tired of fighting with these guys. So figure it out. So Jose Castro hired Jose Zenon, I'm not sure how you pronounce that, Fernandez. And Fernandez was a pretty smart guy. He was actually, it's a long story on Fernandez, but he was a pretty educated guy. And he drew this map of the Rancho San Leandro, which includes what today is San Leandro, San Lorenzo, well, sort of San Leandro, really it's San Leandro and Castro Valley. Okay, as you can see in the drawing. He drew this map with two different ways that they could divide things up. They can divide it up north-south by ABC or east to west by DBE lines. Okay, and this is what was put on the table between Castro and Estudillo and figure out how to divide it. Okay, everybody but Castro came to the conclusion that it was divided by the ABC line. Castro later claimed he never agreed to that, but everybody else seemed to think it was divided by the ABC line. Certainly, Estudillo believed that was the case. Okay, so that's where it's sat. And, you know, the exact borders weren't that important when everybody had 25,000 acres or 10,000 acres. You know, if your cattle wandered on somebody else's land, you got to, they were stamped. What's the word for I'm looking for? Branded. They were branded, so you got them back. So the exact borders didn't make that much difference back in the Mexican era. Turns out that was a really bad idea once the Americans showed up. Okay. Here we've seen this map before. So in 1841, let me go back. So in this division, Castro was allowed to occupy Castro Valley. Estudillo was allowed to occupy San Leandro, but neither were granted any land. So they were, okay, you're there, fine, have a good time, but nobody actually owns anything yet. Okay. So Castro, he's biding his time and he says, well, I want some land in Rancho San Lorenzo to build a home. He only wanted 60 acres. And literally he says in a land free of the inconveniences associated with cattle. So it's the other side of the creek. So you can keep the cattle on the north side and his house wouldn't get overrun by cattle on the south side. And this is where he submitted this diseño, which we saw earlier, showing downtown, what is now Hayward. And in fact, that's where he actually granted 60 acres in downtown, what is now downtown Hayward, to build his house, which he did sometime after 1841. But he still only had 60 acres and permission to hang out in Castro Valley. It's not everything that he wanted. And the other problem with this was another guy, Francisco Soto, had asked for all of Rancho San Lorenzo. And so Castro asking for 60 acres was just making a mess of Francisco Soto's request. So now Castro had to fight with Francisco Soto and with Estudillo to get land. So in 1842, so many years after asking for land, Estudillo and Soto got land grants, much smaller than they ever asked for. They both got about a square league, so nominally about 4,500 acres, although in fact, it was bigger than that. But Castro still had nothing. Here it was 5 years down the line. Everybody's getting a grant except for Castro. So finally, his father put in a new petition with this map, maybe with this map, probably with this map. And he combined land in Castro Valley, whoops, don't do that. He combined land north of the San Lorenzo Creek in Castro Valley with land south of San Lorenzo Creek and said he wanted all of that, 6 square leagues or 27,000 acres. And in rather short order, he got it then. So finally, Governor Mitchell Farina gave him, after all those years of waiting, gave him 27,000 acres, not along the coast. He wanted some land along the coast. He never got that, but it was a very large rancho grant. Okay, so he finally got what he wanted. So Castro and his neighbors all joined the ranks of the Mexican cattle barons who lived in Alta California, and people wrote wonderful things about how great their life was. Never before and never since did people settle down under the blessings of more diverse advantages. The country was lovely, the climate delightful, the valleys were filled with horse and cattle, wants were few, and no one dreaded death. There was meat for the pot and wine for the cup, and no one was in a hurry. Haley wrote that in the first history of Alameda County in 1876. People love to wax poetic about the old Mexican rancheros. Of course, it only lasted a few years, and then the Americans showed up and ruined everything. First, we had the Bear Flag insurrection up in Sonoma. That lasted about a month before the Americans had conquered Monterey, and then the Americans marched up to Sonoma and said, no, you don't get to have an independent republic up here. We're going to make this part of the United States. It might have worked out okay for the Mexican rancho owners. Hadn't gold been discovered, but of course gold was discovered. And all of a sudden, 100,000 people showed up in California. This was good for Castro and his neighbors right off the bat, as the value of cattle went from $4 to $60 a head. So that was really good. But very soon, disappointed miners, which is the vast majority of them, returned to the Bay Area and they looked to establish farms to make a living in the Bay Area. The only problem was all the land was owned by these rancho guys. All the good land was owned by these rancheros. In the middle there, the big rancho is Castro's. Over to the side of the Estudillo Rancho. Just below that is a Soto Rancho. Below that is Vallejo's Rancho. And then we get down to the Mission San Jose. So all the good land was already owned by these rancho owners. But, you know, squatters weren't going to be deterred by something like that. There were no fences. Who were these people? We just beat them in a war. Who says that they can keep all this land? Well, the treaty said they can keep all the land. But so squatters started showing up right and left. Now, squatting to get land was legal if the land met two criteria. Actually, there's a whole list of criteria, but the two main criteria is the land had to belong to the U.S. government, not anybody else, and the land has to have been surveyed. That was not the case. This land did not belong to the U.S. government. It belonged to these rancho owners, and it had not been surveyed when all these squatters started showing up. Nevertheless, California passed a law that somehow empowered squatters. How California could pass a law to empower squatters on nominally federal land, I don't know, but it worked. And it never actually got reversed by the Supreme Court. So squatters started showing up in large numbers. The ranchos had to prove their ownership of the land to a commission that was set up by Congress in 1851, long after the squatters had shown up. And this commission was supposed to run for 3 years. It actually ran for 5 years. And it hardly made any difference because I believe there were 813 cases brought before the commission that were supposed to decide the legitimacy of these rancho grants. Out of the 813, I think only three were not appealed to the courts. And something like 90 of them went to the U.S. Supreme Court. So this resulted in massive delays, averaging 17 years after 1851, 17-year delays in confirming rancho grants. All that time, the rancho owners were pretty much screwed. Castro's cattle were stolen. Squatters took over all the land. Where's Castro going to put his beeves if squatters are building fence around his land? Castro famously lost $35,000 in 1852 and had to take out his first mortgage in 1854. Often said to be his downfall, but that was only a small piece of the downfall. He had loans at interest rates up to 20%, which was reasonably modest in those days. He lived like a lot of the big rancho owners extravagantly. And there's people that talk about him living an extravagant lifestyle, conspicuous consumption, which we had talked about a little bit earlier. His wife was a Peralta. Okay. And the Peralta girls, with the married Peralta girls, tried to break Peralta's will so they can get some of his land up by Oakland and Berkeley. And that took several years and cost a lot of money and went for naught. So they never broke the will. So that was just more money wasted. He defaulted on a property in San Francisco, cost him $10,000. He had multiple court cases to try to kick off squatters. It cost him the equivalent of $40,000 just to serve notice to 69 farmers in 1860. So he was just being taken apart bit by bit. Extremely high legal fees, one after another. His lawyers put mortgages on his rancho as he accrued legal fees. Then, of course, in 1861-62, really in January of 1862, the worst flood in California history hit, far worse than anything we've seen since then, and pretty much wiped out the big rancho owners, north and south in California. When that size flood hits again, which is much more likely in the era of global warming, they expect close to $1 trillion worth of damage. They expect it to be the single most expensive natural disaster in world history. When, not if, when it happens again in California. Anyway, and then that was followed by 2 years where it didn't hardly rain at all. And so Castro was pounded from every which way but loose, and the other rancho owners too. Now, by 1858, the courts had decreed that Castro owned a rancho. He said, oh yeah, 1858, you own a 6-league rancho, 27,000 acres. Then the question came up is, where is it? Where exactly is it? Because remember, the Mexicans, they didn't really care where the borders were because, if your cattle wandered over the next rancho, you know, when the roundup came, you got it back. It didn't really make any difference. But Americans were very different. You were 1 inch over the property line, you were in trouble. Okay. So it took 6 years after they said, yeah, you're good, you're clean, you own a rancho. It took 6 years to come up with a final map. And Castro was a big part of that problem. In many ways, Castro was his own worst enemy. And I remember we talked about this a little bit earlier, this map. This is a superimposition of the first 1858 map with the 1864 final map, where green indicates land that was added to the rancho as part of that 6-year effort. And the trouble really surrounded what is today's called Ashland. That was the hangup, because in 1858, Castro had sold land to Llewellyn, probably a lot of been on Llewellyn Boulevard. He sold land at Llewellyn and Farley in that in that Ashland area. And if it wasn't included in the rancho, he would have to rebate all that money to those guys. That would have been about $200,000 in modern dollars. So Castro really, really wanted that to be part of his rancho, but the US government kept saying, that's not part of your rancho. You can't have that. Here's the problem. Okay, we saw this a little bit earlier. This map shows a couple of different ways that they might have divided the Rancho San Leandro between Estudillo and Castro. Okay. The prefect who was involved in dividing the land, okay, remember we talked about Jose Castro earlier. He was the prefect assigned to come up with a division of the land between Estudillo and Castro. He testified in US courts later on in the 1850s that the division had happened on top of the hilltops. Whereas the map we looked at earlier had the division below the hills on the flatlands. Okay. And Castro insisted, well, that's the divided land, not on the hilltop. But Jose Castro, who was involved in making the division, said, no, it was on the top of the hills. And the government bought into what's called the Jose Castro line, and that excluded Ashland from Castro's rancho. Okay. So now, boom, Castro was going to have to rebate $200,000. So that's pretty bad. And then Castro got in trouble because his own rancho, here is the map that everybody and their brother believed went along with his 1843 application for land, and probably did, to tell you the truth. And notice that the side that bordered on Estudillo was totally flat. There were no bump outs like you see at A there. There were no bump outs to include Ashland. It was totally flat. So the U.S. government said, wait a minute, you can't have this bump out that you want to include Ashland because your own map says there's no such thing. So Castro was kind of screwed. He was going to, here he was trying to get out of the country. He was trying to move to South America. This was really the last thing he had to deal with. And he was involved in a court case. And the government decided, yep, we're going to adopt the Jose Castro dividing land. And here it is superimposed on a modern map. You can see that that's actually running along the hilltops. Castro Valley is on the right. Ashland is on the left. If you follow the Jose Castro dividing line, all of that Ashland area was going to be excluded, and Castro was going to be screwed out of that money. So Castro needed to come up with a way to disavow his own diseño. So how could they go about disavowing his own diseño? So Castro and his lawyer cooked up this plan. He testified, and I have the written testimony. I got the written testimony in a deposition from the Bancroft Library at the University of California, Berkeley. He testified that there was no diseño that went along with his application in 1843. Yeah, there was a reference to a diseño in the application, but that's just boilerplate. Everybody that's in all of the applications. There was no real map. That map that you're looking at actually was made in 1849, just so my lawyer could see what was going on. So it had nothing to do with the grant. And it turned out if you read the grant to Castro, it made no reference to a map. And usually if a map was involved, it was referenced in the grant. There was no map mentioned. This was a last minute ruse. Well, the American lawyers, the US lawyers called it what it was, a ruse. This was a last minute ruse by Castro to try to disavow his diseño, and much to the consternation of the US attorneys, it worked. And the judge who was involved, who had already decided not to include the Ashland area, said, oh, yeah, everybody's gotten it wrong heretofore. Yeah, sure, you can have that area, no problem. So Castro got the grant, and by this point, he had already left. By the time the thing was signed off, he had already left the United States. He had sold the rancho off, but he never had to rebate the $200,000 because he pulled off this ruse where he disavowed his own diseño, his own map. So that worked. And boy, the U.S. attorneys were really peeved off. And they say as much in the court record. So as I said, Castro was done. He said, I'm out of here. He sold his rancho to Faxon Atherton in February of 1863 for $130,000 with the assumption of 2 loans to his attorney and forgiveness of 2 loans to Atherton amounting to $70,000. So the net value to Castro was about $200,000, of which $130,000 was cash that he would sail to South America with. And that translates to something like $3 million in modern dollars. So don't cry for Don Guillermo compared to his one cousin who was bankrupt by 1857, another cousin who got hung for a crime he didn't commit. Guillermo Castro made out pretty well. In the Alameda County records, you find that as he was getting ready to leave in 1863, he deeded to his son ownership of any residual land rights he might have in California for $5 in natural love and affection. So just in case he owned anything left, his son Juan could represent, he would own that land if anything came up, because he was headed for South America. Now, the record of the sale is in Alameda County records. It took me 8 hours of searching through hand scribbled notes to find book N, page 295. That is the sale of the rancho. And there's a name for that, sale in lieu of default. Okay, that's what it's called. Rather than default on the loan, which he probably was going to do, he said, okay, I'll sell you, I'll give you a good deal on the rancho. And that's what he did. It's right there. It's very clear. There's no doubt. And Castro testified. In 1863, Castro testified in court, I have sold my rancho. Okay, so it was gone by 1863. Yet, in 1969, they were getting ready to open a new park in Castro Valley that they had decided to call Don Castro Recreation Area. And this was the East Bay Regional Park District park on Alameda County Flood Control District land, which happened twice in Castro Valley. They had the PR guy for the East Bay Regional Park District develop a history of Castro, which was by far the best history of Guillermo Castro that had ever been published up to that point. And I was able to confirm almost everything that he wrote about, except he added another part. He added a part at the end where in 1864, the rancho was foreclosed in this dramatic foreclosure sale on the courthouse steps for $400,000 rather than for a value of $200,000. As far as I can tell, he made that up. I can't prove it conclusively, but there is, I think the evidence is 96% in favor that he made that up to embellish his story in 1969, figuring that nobody was going to go through the effort to try to prove him wrong. I mean, it was clear that he had sold the land. Faxon Atherton was already selling land in 1863. So there's overwhelming evidence that Atherton had taken over before 1864. Plus, for example, he says it was sold on the courthouse steps by a certain sheriff, Sheriff Mayhew, in 1864. Sheriff Mayhew was no longer the sheriff in 1864. So I actually think he made this up. I got the original. So it was published in many newspapers in edited and often butchered forms. So I got the actual original public release from the East Bay Park District. So I made sure I had it right. And one thing I need to do is I asked them, was there anything else in the file? They said, no, nothing else in the file. But maybe somewhere else in their files, there's some records that indicate, was it real or was it made up, this whole thing about the 1864 foreclosure? Best I can determine, it was fake. Maybe. So it turns out there was a little karma involved here too, because Guillermo and his wife's great-great-grandson was the revolutionary leader Che Guevara, who along with Fidel Castro, no known relationship, caused much trouble for the same U.S. government that harassed Guillermo Castro and driven him out to South America. And here you see all the way, go back, wrong button. Here you see from Luis Peralta, because of course, Guillermo Castro's wife, Maria, was a Peralta woman, all the way down to Ernesto Che Guevara,
born in 1928. So a little bit of karma. There are a few times in my book I talk about karma. This was a little bit of one of them. What about the original questions that I had asked in the very beginning of my project before it became a 4-year project? What were the namesakes of all the roads in my neighborhood? Well, we already saw the Brickell Way is named after the original farmer that legitimately bought the land there, Josiah and Bridget Brickell. And that was actually named by his daughter in 1938. Haley Drive, Elrod Drive, and Mancini Drive were named for the 3 developers who developed the property in 1948 and 1949. So that's Marlon Wallace Haley. Remember M.W. Haley signed off on the blueprints for my house back in 1949. He was the subdivider. He was the actual developer. Elrod was John Richard Elrod. He was the guy that sold the lots and arranged for houses to be built. They were all custom houses. And Mancini, he was John Adolph Mancini. He was the engineer on the project. And so they wrote their names into the map. There's a Haley Road in Newark too, and that's named after a predecessor. But Haley's an interesting guy because on both sides of his family, it was all 49ers. So his family traces all the way back to 1949 on the Haley side and on the Marlin side. So he's an interesting character. And I had actually, all these people were fairly well described in the history books, in the newspapers. So I was able to write up full page descriptions of their lives and their histories as part of the original book. And the very first question I asked, could I discern all owners of the land I lived on back until the Native Americans, back into the Oregon and the Yaqui. Yep, there it is. From the Native Americans to Mission San Jose, Mexican government, Guillermo Castro, Faxon Atherton, Josiah Brickell, Bridget Brickell after Josiah died, Mary and Hannah Brickell after Bridget died. Then they split it up, so only Hannah owned it. She in 1948, so she kept it for 62 years. That's why it was easy to trace. Marlon Haley bought it in 1948, and then all the people that owned the house from 1949 to us, who are the 6th owners of the house, are there. So I succeeded in my original project to trace the ownership of my property all the way back to the Native Americans. The end. So any questions?
Kim, are there any questions back there? Any questions from the audience right here?
Every map that you showed there, you access that like you told us in the beginning?
Well, there were 3 or 4 sources for maps. The most of them came from the Alameda County, but that's only after 1853. Yeah. The maps before that, they come from, like the old Mexican maps. Those come from, ultimately they trace back to the Bancroft Library in Berkeley, but they're online. You can find those online. They're on California Online, or if you just put in the Senos, California, you can come up with hundreds of these maps. And they're actually, the originals are up in Berkeley, but all the other maps are online. Some of the other old maps were from the map collection over at Stanford University. But most of the maps after 1853 come from Alameda County. Yeah. Yeah. So I'm pretty good at manipulating images because I've been an amateur photographer for a lot of years. So I would take old maps and superimpose them with new maps. Even if I just had like the first map of Castro Valley Boulevard in 1855, there was no map, but they had the survey directions. So I could take the survey directions. It would say so many feet at such an angle, then so many feet at such an angle. They didn't give feet, they gave what are called chains. But I know a chain is 66 feet. And so from that, I could actually draw a map and then I could superimpose it on a new map. And so I was able to take the old maps and put them on new maps to make it easy to interpret. Yeah. So I'm good at Photoshop, and all that stuff was done in Photoshop. It wasn't, most of the old maps lined up pretty well, but not always. Sometimes it's like I had to take the best guess. But most of the old maps, they were legitimate surveyors in those days, and they mostly line up pretty good. Sometimes, for example, in Castro Valley, the Castro Valley Boulevard was radically different from what we have now. And eventually I tracked that down and figured out why that happened. So yeah, the old maps that the county provided were remarkable.
Are you going to continue and do a modern, take off when you left off presentation?
Well, I cover pretty much everything up to about 1970, and then I hit the highlights after 1970. So I have stuff that happened in 2002 in the book. So I do cover more modern stuff. But I leave, if somebody wants to write a detailed history of the last 50 years, I leave that to somebody else. But I do cover stuff that goes up to 2000.
Okay,
Also, there's the radical thing of putting in footnotes and endnotes. And there's over 1,000 footnotes and endnotes. So if you find something that's interesting, you can almost certainly find out where I got it. And most of those things can be found online. Not all of them, but a lot of them can be found online.
you gave us a condensed version of
I gave you a condensed version of a small part of it. It's 500 pages, so it's hard to condense all of it.
I wanted to add one thing here that really impressed me when I went through the book is, you know, in the modern era where we live around Fremont, Newark, Union City, we don't normally think about our attachment to someplace like Castro Valley or the Tri-Valley area. And yet everything starts here with our mission right across the street in terms of, you know, all the land subdivisions and the descendants and the land grants and how development was shaped, you know, from a rural area, agricultural, to industry, and now living in a very complex urban environment.
caught my eye at the very end was a flood. And the following winter, a drought.
2 years of drought,
Yeah.
and then the year after that, everything burned down. So,
How severe was it?
so the 1862 flood is far worse than anything that ever happened since. It was, like I said, if it happens again, it's going to be the most expensive natural disaster in world history.
No, that's because there were no flood control.
Flood controls will be of no use when this happens.
Because I was married in 1955, and then I was trying to make a few extra bucks when school, I was teaching in Irvington. And I was going to Hayward and working in a, you know, right for Christmas, in a little hardware store on B Street. I can't remember the name. And the one exit into Niles was flooded.
Yeah, that was the 1955 flood that flooded all of Niles and
Yeah.
into Union City.
I guess I was able to go on Mission Boulevard, you know, because there's no freeways.
Right.
But then, because of it raining so much, there wasn't much business, and they said, well, we don't need to anymore.
There's another map I found in the archives that if I had it printed, I would have brought it, but I haven't. The reason I haven't printed it because I want to print big, and the place I do have my printing done can't mount things that big, and neither can I. So I haven't. I found the 1961 map of all possible planned routes on the Foothill Freeway. Mike. I found this fantastic map, and I think the original was probably 6 feet. Because it's very high resolution, shows all the like 10 different possible routes of the never built Foothill Freeway that would start just south of Castro Valley and run all the way down as far as I guess 680 in Fremont. And there were all these different routes and everybody hated all of them. And I talk about it. I talk about the Castro Valley component of it in the book, because actually a great grandson of Brickell was the guy who the road ran through Hayward, and he didn't want it to run through Hayward. So he convinced the state to run it through Castro Valley. And his convincing the state to run the road through Castro Valley in 1961 is still causing problems in Castro Valley on this very day. So that what he did in 1961 is still causing problems in Castro Valley.
I wanted to mention one other thing. How intimately important this mission was here in Mission San Jose to the greater East Bay area. We were intimately involved with all of the lands around here. And I remember John Weed and I, years ago, we were on a field trip with other people up to Los Vaqueros Reservoir up in Contra Costa County. And we went into the visitor center. And what is the centerpiece of the visitor center? It's Mission San Jose. And the fact that the vaqueros were the cowboys that were managing all these large herds of cattle all the way from here out into the Tri-Valley area up to Brentwood. That's how much influence this mission had. And there were tens of thousands of heads of cattle, roaming these hills, all under the supervision of this mission. No fences.
I have a funny story too, because a couple of years ago, in the Irvington Cemetery, there's a lot of pioneers. So I was, my daughter was married to a man who was a sergeant, and his brass flat was here. But on two sides of it, one of them was like a pillar, and it was Horner. And then right across the street is the Horner Junior High School. So I said, and my kids went there. So I said, I'll talk about Horner. And then there was the other pillar was Bam. I never got to talk about Bam. But anyway, so I said, I better find out more about it. And I never went up close to the pillar until I'm just about ready to give the talk in about a week or so. And I find out it's not John Horner or William Horner, his brother. It says C.W. Horner. Oh my God. So I have to come here to the lady that's in charge. And we looked up at census maps. And then there's a book, I think it was written by a man named Wood, about pioneers. It was.
Well, that's the
from
1883
Alameda
history.
County.
Yeah.
And so I found out that John Horner's brother William, and his home is on Driscoll Road, it's still existing, had a son named Charles Frederick, right? So C.F. Horner, I mean, that's what was on the pillar. So I find out when you look at census reports, they can be wrong.
Oh, yeah.
Like if someone comes and takes a census and there's a 2-year-old and they call him Charlie and they don't give you any other name. So then when he's about 21 years old and he went to school locally, well, the two brothers did a lot of farming, but like there were drought years and they went to Maui, both of them with Charles Frederick. So he's there a couple of years and he comes back and gets married to a daughter of a Mr. Dakota. Okay, and then they approved that in a newspaper article, which names all the guests that came to the wedding and what they received as presents, right? So then he went back, and the two brothers never came here. They're not buried in Irvington Cemetery. They're probably in a cemetery in Maui. And he came back, and he became a supervisor in a sugar mill. And then he came here, and he was I think a Alameda County supervisor at one point. He was instrumental in building a road that, where the wagons wouldn't sink down in the.
That was a big problem early on.
Building a bridge over Alameda Creek. And so that's CF.
Yeah.
Wally,
I said, oh my God.
we'll continue this after we
Oh,
close
yeah,
down the
I'm
official
sorry.
meeting. We can talk,
But-
share these stories. So let me just thank our guest here very much. And by the way, Rick, one gentleman that left earlier, Brian Barlow, past president of Washington Township, he and his wife own the Horner home over on
really?
Driscoll Road and have completely refurbished it. It's one of the gems in our community. Yeah. So, so thank you, Rick, very much for your time here, and we'll try to forward any questions to your email address. And it's been absolutely wonderful, and you deserve so many compliments for the years of research that went into this. It's going to be a treasure for a century to come.
Well, hope not century.
Thank you very much, and we'll close the meeting.
The meat people in the library